Welcome to Clouded Dreams. I'm Sarah, and today we're going to put paint onto paper and talk about basic watercolor techniques. We're going to talk about the applications and washes. Washes are thin diluted layers of watercolor that are applied over very large areas, and they are often used in underpaintings or laying down basic colors in a painting. Watercolor can be applied very wet to very dry, the paint, and it can be applied to very dry, moist, or very wet paper. So each of these wash and paper combinations are going to produce a different effect for you, and knowing when to use them and why in your art piece is going to make the process easier for you. So I'm going to switch over so that you can see what I'm working on and work along with me. Okay, so to start with, I'm going to grid off my paper. I'm going to give a 1/2 inch border on either side and 1 inch on my top, and then I'm going to do 4 different columns in 2 different rows. So I'm going to go ahead and outline everything and label it with my number 8. So this is where all the fun happens now. We are going to get started. I'm using a 3/4, an 8, a 4, and a little liner brush for today. Our first technique is going to be wet on wet, and this one achieves a very fluid, somewhat unpredictable effect. The colors tend to blend into each other, and it is exactly what it sounds like. It is wet paper and wet paint. So what we're going to do first is get your flat brush and brush out a little rectangle within your within this rectangle. You want something, it doesn't have to be perfect. This is just experimenting. This is like a little reference sheet, but I want it to all be pretty saturated. You can see my little, the sheen of it, all wet. I'm going to redo the middle a little. Okay. I'm going to dip my brush into the paint and kind of wiggle it around. Sometimes I even spin it. Butterfly. What you'll notice is all of the edges are pretty fuzzy. They're real soft. This one will give you hazy line work. If you want it to be lighter, you can rinse out your brush and then take some of that color out. And if you really want to take some of the color out, you can either take it out with your cotton swabs, or with paper towels. Okay, so this is my butterfly for my wet on wet. You can tell that it's all fuzzy, and that is somewhat of the nature of wet on wet. I'm going to rinse my brush out, and we'll go on to the next technique. So for the next one, we are going to do wet on dry, and this one allows for more control over where your paint goes. So your surface needs to be dry, otherwise it would be wet on wet. I'm going to once again load my brush up with water. I'm going to kind of spin it a little bit. Go here. Okay, and then I'm going to get my little liner brush and put in my little details. This one is going to allow for more control over where your paint goes. It takes a little bit of patience because you have to let the layers dry somewhat in between. There's my wet on dry little, you can definitely see the difference between wet on wet and wet on dry. So next up we're going to go to dry on dry, which is most commonly known as dry brushing. This one you're not going to wet your surface because it's dry. This one you're going to use your paper towel. I tend to get mine and fold it into segments like this, so it's thicker. You're going to load up your paintbrush the same that you have. And notice that it's very wet, right? So you're going to wipe it against so that it absorbs a lot of that water out of it, so that you still have paint, but it's dry, okay? And then you're going to paint your little thing again. With this one, you're going to want to use the minimal amount of water that you can, and then dry it out even more on this sheet of paper towel before lightly brushing onto your paper. It's a real light touch. This technique is great for trying to create rough textures. It's good for our shimmering bodies of water. You can vary the pressure of your brush while you're painting. And since the paint is pretty dry, it stays where you put it for the most part. It's not going to bleed out the way that wet on wet bleeds out. So that's one of the advantages of this one. Our next one is going to be dry on wet. So this one we're going to cover our entire box with, you can use a flat brush or you can use, actually let me label it first. Blue green down. So we're going to wait until there's still a sheen to the paper, but not a whole lot. You don't want it sopping wet for this because then it's wet on wet. It's more like a moist paper. And then we're going to paint our little purple butterfly on here. So this one, you'll notice that there is a little bit of bleeding in it, a little bit of haziness, but not at all to this level. And for the most part, you can still control where the paint goes so you have a little bit more control. If you want to reduce the amount of bleeding that you have, that fuzziness is called bleeding. If you want to reduce that even more, then wait until the paper is a little bit more dry. So those are your basic 4 applications. You're going to have wet on wet, wet paper. This one has wet paper. This one is dry paper, wet paint with dry paint. So those are your 4 different applications. And now we're going to go on to our washes. With practice, you're going to be able to learn to control your results by judging the wetness of the paper. If it's too wet, the colors are going to merge completely, and if it's too dry, then you're probably going to get this scratchy effect on it. So we're going to start with a flat wash. Your flat wash is essentially a wet on wet technique. You can do it 2 ways. You can do it wet on wet or wet paint with dry. So we'll do both. So for this one, I'm going to wet the section that I want to paint in, and the paint will stay within where I have it painted. And then I'm going to load up my brush with blue. That, and I'm going to start at the top. Usually you'll get the best results painting in one direction, so from top to bottom. You can even tilt your board or your paper as you paint it and collect that bottom bead of paint. If you want to get a uniform color across all of it, you're going to want to mix up more than you think you need. And like if you're doing a sky or a background, you're going to you'll mix up more than you want, and then you can apply it in a very large batch of color. Watercolor dries lighter than what you're seeing when it's wet, so keep that in mind. Whenever you're finished with the wash, leave it alone to dry, because if you do go back and mess with it a lot, it's going to become uneven. And taking too long to get that color in might cause it to look uneven also. So the other way of doing a flat wash is not having it wet first and having dry paper. And we're going to use a green for this. I'm just going to load my brush and put it here. You can tilt your paper like I said earlier. If you see something that is pooling too much, like there's too much of one color in your area, otherwise just leave it flat. But those are washes. Your next set is going to be a graded wash. This is going to be your ombre. It's changing the value of your wash. So we're going to do yellow. And since I loaded it up, so we're going to start out by wetting our paper where we want it, right here. We're going to load up our brush. We'll start at the top with our yellow, and then using the side of the brush, just slowly drag that color down. And if you find that you have too much color, not enough value change, then you can take some of that paint up. But that is your graded wash from dark to light. And we're just going to paint directly on here and go down. I'm going to move my brush, and then I'm going to clean it out and put water up to it. Now, if you have too much water, you're going to create what is called a back run, which I'm going to purposefully do here and put too much water. And so a back run is a common problem caused by having too much water on your brush, and it produces this feathery pattern in your damp wash. So here is a back run. Do you see how it's creating this these lines? So how you fix that is you take up some of your water by either dabbing it on your towel. You take up your water, you get your brush damp again, and you kind of rub over it. And then blend that back up. Because what we're looking for is a real nice gradual change. That's what we're looking for here. So we have dark color, and then we bring it down to this light color. Like that. So all of this needs to be done before the paint dries, but see, you can fix the back runs. The next one that we're going to go over is, it's a variegated wash. The variegated wash, it's also your blending. This is one color going into another color, and we're going to put down our water first and make a little box here. We'll start with purple here, and we're going to pull it down, and then we're going to do pink, I think. And we'll start at the bottom where we have it's still wet and go up. And we want this to blend real nice. So your blending colors are good for your underlaying or your underpainting layers, like painting a sunset where the colors fade from one to the other, or for like watery surfaces. The paint that you put down can be a little bit more saturated because the colors tend to fade with this wet on wet technique. But I'm going to do it dry also. I'm going to do blue and green, I think. So not putting any water down first and then blending. And I think I'm going to go ahead and... So the very last one that we're going to cover is called glazing. This is another word for layering. Because watercolor is transparent in nature, you can see each of the brush strokes that you lay down under the layers that were prior to it. So what we're going to do here is we're going to start with yellow. So all I did was put bands of color down, and I let them dry in between each of the layers, and you can see the other prior layers coming through each of the brush strokes. So this is called glazing. Anytime you layer paint on top of the prior layer. So this is the demonstration for today. Thank you so much for being here, and if you haven't already, please like and subscribe. I'll have more videos coming out soon, and have a wonderful day.